creative enterprise, a creative undertaking that each and every one of us can undergo. We don't have to be creative artists or part of the cultural elite or anything like that. And so he says the Oedipus myth will not do as the central myth of analysis because it's essentially a detective myth. It involves the use of the analytical mind. Oedipus is sort of trying to sniff out what's happened to him, and it's a violent myth and ends in violence, and there really is no creativity there. So he says that won't do. So he kind of throws that out. And he says, well, now, what was the central myth of analysis for Jung? Well, it was the hero myth, in particular the night sea journey, the descent of the ego/hero into the unconscious, the abyss, and undergoing transformation, particularly the threshold that Jung liked to focus on was the transformation from adolescence to maturity, and then the later one from old age to death. But the problem with the hero myth is that it too is a control myth. The hero is somebody who goes down in, and into the abyss and has this sort of dragon-slaying mentality with respect to the archetypal powers, and that won't do either because it's too violent. And also the hero inevitably ends up becoming the sort of tyrannical king that he starts by slaying. So the cycle of renewal where the hero slays the sort of king, as in Fraser's Golden Bough, who's become a tyrant and then usurps his position, won't do either. So he says, what is the central myth of analysis? Well, he says, let's look at analysis. Analysis is soul-making, it is creativity. Well, let's look at creativity. What's creativity all about? And it turns out that there are a number of different modes of creativity with a different archetype associated with each mode. So he goes, well, here are a couple of ideas of creativity. We have creativity in terms of the senex, and the senex is the old man, and this is essentially Saturn. The senex creativity has to do with creativity. It's right there on the first page of the book of Genesis. It is creativity as a process of bringing order onto chaos, as Yahweh does on the first page of the book of Genesis when he creates through a series of bifurcations this nice ordered system of the cosmos. In Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge does the same thing, except he uses mathematics, quite specifically imposes order on chaos through a very complex system of geometry. And this is creation in terms of the senex. It's entirely traditional creativity and has regard for tradition. It's the sort of wise old man, the stern figure. And we might define it as creativity as identical with order. Then the other kind of creativity has to do with the puer, and the puer is the child archetype. And Hillman often plays the senex and puer, the old man and the young child, off against each other. And the puer archetype here is the emphasis on originality. This is creativity where the traditional is no longer the primary thing, but the emphasis on the unique. And this is the creativity that comes in the 19th century with the Romantics. It starts to come in during the Enlightenment in the 18th century, where there's a kind of disregard of certain aspects of tradition. And if you look at the history of Western civilization, there's a move from the senex emphasis on tradition to the puer emphasis on originality. For example, just look at Shakespeare's plays. They're all already stories that were quite common. And you don't come up with new stories in the Renaissance. You recycle old stories and you impose art on them, and the whole thing has to do with the order that you're bringing to them, how well you can make someone deliver a speech. That's where the creativity is, not coming up with new stories. Hamlet was already based on an older Hamlet story that had been taken over, for example, from the Danes, and so on. The novel then comes in the 18th century as what it says, new, and you begin to have new, fresh, original characters. Tom Jones, for example, Clarissa. These are all new, unique characters. They are no longer just mythic stereotypes, as in the Renaissance and the medieval period. They're not just recycled Greek divinities. They're new, interesting, individual people. So you have this gradual shift out of tradition into the new thing, the unique, the original. Yes?
Is it something like the Romantics kind of brought back that thing with the noble savage or something?
Yes, yes. There's a lot of tradition in the Romantics, and particularly insofar as they rely upon myth. They pull in even more myth than had been the case in the 18th century. But the emphasis is on what each of them can do with it uniquely. I mean, this whole sort of Blake's whole creation of his own sort of private cosmos is just a paradigmatic example of that.
Well,
emphasis. That's right. And there's a totally fresh, totally new myth there that no one had come up with before. So those are the two types of creativity. We might also say they represent the classic versus the romantic. And the debate between classicism and romanticism is now forgotten by everyone. It was a very old, outmoded literary debate, but that's in there. The third type of creativity is creativity in terms of the shadow, and this was the creativity of the 60s, which is essentially creativity defined as pure, raw, primal power. And it's essentially Pluto, although he doesn't mention that. He mentions that it's the shadow. And it's a kind of creativity that has to do with just a total meltdown of forms, a total meltdown of tradition. I think William Burroughs is, in literature, the perfect personification of this, because he sets about to write novels with the intent of wiping every staple of the novel out. There's no continuity of character. There are no central characters. There is no plot. And that kind of raw, primal Dionysian, it's creativity in terms of just pure chaos. The chaos is now the primary power that's fueling the drive. And that was the creativity of a lot of what was going on in the 60s.
So it's the tour number 2, would that be like Mercury?
I think so, yes. Mercury.
Mars. The child? Mars. Mercury, Mars.
Mercury times up Mars. And then number 4.
Wendy would be Venus.
What?
Wendy would be Venus.
Wendy?
Yeah, in the forest transition. And it would be...
In Peter Pan?
Yeah, in Peter Pan.
Yeah.
And Wendy Venus.
Oh, okay. I see what's going right now.
The fourth type of creativity is...
I was thinking hamburgers too.
is creativity in terms of the ego, which is the creativity of science. And here creativity is defined as problem solving. And the archetype here turns out to be Prometheus because of the Western sort of defiance of the gods, and everything that has been created in terms of Western science, from the rocket to the steam engine back to the mechanical clock, is created out of the attempt of the ego to solve a very specific rational problem. So it's kind of very intense left brain analytical type of creativity, but creative nonetheless. And then we have the fifth type of creativity is from the point of view of the persona, and we remember that the persona is the social role, the social mask, and this is the celebrity. I think Madonna is probably the best example of this type of creativity through continually changing your persona. The image, the mask that you show forth in society is just radically redone by her over and over again. And all our celebrities evince this kind of creativity of changing your image as in itself creative. You share it, right? All the celebrities. More.
If there was a nuclear holocaust, there would be roaches and bears. They said about her, and I guess she was quite fond of that. She thought that was great.
And then we have the Great Mother. The Great Mother as source and womb and inspiration, and create this sort of the whole tradition of creativity, invocation to the muses, and the mother as the creative source of life, and the goddess, and from out of which nature comes, and all of that. So he says these are the 6 primary examples of creativity that I can think of, and he says none of them quite capture the myth of analysis that I'm after, which is soul-making. And you'll remember he says that Jung's word for soul is the anima. Well, the anima is something different from the Great Mother, and the creativity there has to do with soul-making. And it is creativity out of a sense of love for the soul. And this is what he wants. The myth of analysis has to do with soul-making, and it will need to be a myth that demonstrates the soul's love for itself, or the ego's love for the soul. And the anima personifies that precisely, and he says, well, the central myth here is the story of Cupid and Psyche, and the Cupid and Psyche story turns out to be for him the primary myth of analysis. So I think it's worth recalling that myth briefly. As it's told by Abrelius in The Golden Ass. The story goes that there are these 3 daughters and of a very wealthy king and queen, and one of the daughters, Psyche, the soul, is so beautiful that men are coming from far and wide just to have a glance at her, and they are deserting the temples of Venus. And Venus takes great offense at this, and she's very upset about it, so she goes to her son Cupid and she says, I want you to shoot one of your arrows into her, and into some poor wretch that she will fall in love